The first sound he'd heard that wasn't the wind or his own heartbeat in 3 years was a whimper. It was a thin, ragged thing, almost lost in the creak of the barn's old timber. Silas Blackwood stopped, hand on the heavy door, the setting sun painting the dust motes in the air a bruised orange. He was a man carved from the same hard land he worked, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. Solitude had been his penance, his shield, and his prison. He didn't get visitors. The rutted track to his ranch was a promise of nothing, and the world had learned to keep its distance. He slid the door open. The smell of hay and dry earth greeted him, familiar and comforting. Then, another smell. Fear. It was sharp, metallic, animal. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light, found her in the corner stall, burrowed into a pile of loose straw like a dying field mouse. She couldn't have been more than 10, a tangle of filthy hair and limbs so thin they looked like they'd snap. Her eyes were wide, black pools of terror in a face smudged with dirt and tears. He saw the tremor in her hands, the hollows in her cheeks. This was not a runaway child who'd missed dinner. This was a ghost, half-stepped out of her own grave. He took a slow step forward. She flinched, pulling her knees tighter to her chest, a soft, guttural sound catching in her throat. He stopped. He knew that look. He'd seen it in a coyote caught in a trap, chewing its own leg off to be free. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice a rusty hinge from disuse. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off her, and left the barn door cracked open, a sliver of fading light against the profound dark she inhabited. He returned not with questions, but with a bowl of lukewarm broth and a canteen of water. He set them on the ground, a good 10 feet from her hiding place. He didn't speak again. He just sat on an overturned bucket, his shotgun laid across his lap, and watched the barn fall into shadow. He waited. An hour passed, the sky outside turning from bruised orange to deep indigo. The wind picked up, whistling a lonely tune through the eaves. He heard a rustle. Then a small, hesitant slurp. He didn't look. He just listened to the sound of a life being pulled back from the edge, sip by painful sip. He stayed there all night, a silent guardian for a secret he didn't yet understand. When the first hint of dawn crept through the slats in the wall, he saw the empty bowl and the half-empty canteen. The girl was asleep, her breathing still shallow, but steady. For the first time in years, the silence of the ranch felt different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that by bringing that bowl of broth, he had invited something more than a starving child into his life. He had invited trouble. And he knew, with that same weary certainty, that he wouldn't turn it away. What is the line between caution and cowardice? And when a desperate soul appears at your door, do you have the right to pretend you didn't see them? He carried her into the house as the sun crested the eastern plains. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of bones wrapped in a tattered dress. He laid her in the small bedroom at the back of the house, the one he hadn't entered since the fever took Mary, and little Sarah with her. The room was a shrine, untouched. A small wooden bird his daughter had carved sat on the nightstand, its painted wing chipped. He pulled a thick quilt over the girl, his movements clumsy, unpracticed. Her breathing was the only sound, a fragile rhythm in the house of ghosts. He spent the day on the porch, cleaning his rifle, his gaze fixed on the long, empty road. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching engine. Every hawk's cry sounded like a shout. He was a man who had chosen to be a forgotten island, and now he felt the tide rising. The girl, Lena, as he would come to know her, slept for 20 hours straight. When she woke, she drank more broth and ate a piece of soft bread, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't speak. She just watched him with an unnerving stillness, as if trying to decipher whether he was her savior or just the next monster in a long line of them. He found the mark 2 days later, while trying to clean a cut on her arm. A crude brand on the inside of her wrist, a letter T inside a broken circle. It wasn't a rancher's brand. It was a mark of ownership, seared into her flesh to declare her as property. The sight of it lit a cold fire in his gut. This wasn't a lost child. This was an escapee. The next morning, he rode his old mare into town, a place he avoided like a plague. Persimmon Creek was little more than a single dusty street, a collection of weathered storefronts held together by rust and quiet desperation. He needed supplies. Medicine, soft foods, and something for the girl to wear besides rags. He tied the mare outside Miller's General Store, the bell above the door, announcing his unwelcome arrival. Miller, a man whose spine had been replaced by a stack of IOUs, gave him a nervous glance. "Silas," he said, wiping the counter with a greasy rag. "Been a while." Silas nodded, his list in hand. He gathered what he needed, his presence sucking the air out of the room. When he placed a small, simple cotton dress on the counter, Miller's eyes widened. "Expecting company?" he asked, trying for casual. The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken suspicion. As Silas paid, Deputy Calloway walked in. He was a man who enjoyed his authority a little too much, his hand always resting on the butt of his pistol. He looked at Silas, then at the child's dress, and a slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. "Buying gifts, Blackwood," Calloway said, his voice slick. "Didn't figure you for the paternal type." Silas met his gaze, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He just picked up his things and walked out, the deputy's cold stare following him all the way to his horse. The ride home was tense. He felt eyes on his back, the town's suspicion like a physical weight. He knew the brand on Lena's wrist and the deputy's smirk were connected. He was no longer just a recluse. He was a man with a secret, and in a town this small, secrets were currency for vultures. That night, a storm rolled in, the same kind of violent, churning tempest that had raged the week his world ended. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the rain came down in sheets. Lena cried out in her sleep, a muffled scream of pure terror. Silas went to her room, standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the lightning flashes. The sight of her, small and terrified in his daughter's bed, broke something open in him that had been sealed shut for years. The memory came unbidden, sharp and cruel as a shard of glass. Sarah, his Sarah. Her small body burning with fever, her breath coming in shallow gasps just like the girl's in the barn. He remembered holding her hand, feeling the life slip away like grains of sand through his fingers. He remembered the doctor arriving 2 days too late, his face grim, the storm having washed out the only road. He had buried his wife and daughter on the hill behind the house, and then he had buried himself. He had blamed the storm, the doctor, God. But most of all, he had blamed himself for being helpless, for being just a man against the indifferent cruelty of nature. Now, another storm was here, and another child was in that bed. He walked over and sat on the edge of the mattress. "It's just the wind," he whispered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "It's just the wind. It'll pass." He stayed there until her breathing evened out, until the storm outside broke. He wasn't just protecting a stranger anymore. He was standing guard over his own shattered heart, trying to mend a wound so old he'd forgotten it was still bleeding. This time, he would not be helpless. This time, the storm would have to go through him. They came 3 days later. A pristine black automobile kicking up a plume of dust, an ugly scar on the landscape. Two men got out, dressed in dark suits that looked out of place against the prairie. The third, the one who emerged from the passenger side, was different. He was tall and immaculately dressed, with a silver-topped cane and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He walked with an air of absolute ownership, as if the very ground he stepped on belonged to him. Silas met them on the porch, his shotgun held loosely in one hand. The man smiled, a predator's smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I am Jedediah Thorne. I believe you may have found something of mine." His gaze flickered toward the house. "A stray. Small thing. Answers to the name Lena. She has a sentimental value." Silas's knuckles were white around the shotgun. He thought of the brand on her wrist. Sentimental value. The words were a vile desecration. "Ain't seen anyone," Silas said, his voice flat. "It's just me and the ghosts out here." Thorne's smile tightened. "I run a home for unfortunate children, Mr. Blackwood. A place of charity. This girl is a ward of my institution. She is confused, unwell. It would be unfortunate if she fell into the wrong hands." The threat was veiled in politeness, but it was as sharp as a knife's edge. "She is my property, legally speaking, and I always recover my property." He tapped his cane on the porch steps. "I will be back. I suggest you search your conscience. And your barn." The men got back in the car and drove away, leaving behind a silence more menacing than their words. Silas stood there for a long time, the dust settling around him. He had lied. He had drawn a line in the sand. Now he had to wait for the tide to come in. What would you do? When a man who holds all the power asks for something that isn't his, do you hand it over for the sake of peace? Or do you stand your ground, knowing peace is no longer an option? The days that followed were thick with a quiet tension. The girl, Lena, began to heal. Color returned to her cheeks, and the haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a cautious curiosity. She still didn't speak much, but her silence was different. It was no longer born of pure terror, but of shyness, of a life spent unheard. One afternoon, Silas found her in the yard, watching a fledgling that had fallen from its nest. It chirped weakly, one wing bent at an awkward angle. She looked up at him, her expression a silent plea. Together, they fashioned a small splint from a twig and a scrap of cloth. They placed the bird in a shoebox filled with cotton and left it on the porch. That evening, as Silas was mending a broken fence post, Lena came and stood beside him, handing him the nails one by one. Her small hand would brush his calloused one, a fleeting touch that felt like an anchor in a storm. "Fences are easier than people," he grumbled, more to himself than to her. "They mostly stay where you put 'em." A tiny sound escaped her lips. It took him a moment to recognize it. A laugh. It was small and fragile, like the birds chirping, but it was real. In that moment, watching the setting sun cast a golden glow on her face, the hardened shell around his heart cracked just a little wider. He was teaching her how to mend things, but she was the one fixing him. The ranch was no longer just a place of survival. It was becoming a place of healing, a home. But the shadow of Thorne's promise loomed, a darkness on the horizon that even the brightest sunset couldn't erase. The first message was a dead steer. He found it by the creek, its throat cut, left for the vultures. It was one of his best, a clear, brutal warning. The second message came from Persimmon Creek. Miller, the store owner, refused to sell him grain. "Sorry, Silas," he'd mumbled, not meeting his eye. "My supply, it ran low." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Thorne's influence was a poison, seeping into every corner of the county. He was being starved out, isolated completely. Then Sheriff Brody paid him a visit, his cruiser crawling up the drive like a black beetle. He didn't get out of the car, just rolled down the window. "Silas," he said, his face tired and grim, "I'm telling you this as a friend. Give the girl back to Thorne." "She's not a sack of flour, Brody," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. He branded her. The sheriff sighed, a long, defeated sound. "I know, but Thorne, he owns the water rights. He owns the bank. He put me in this office. Some things are just the way they are. You can't win this fight. All you can do is choose how much you're gonna lose." He rolled up the window and drove away, leaving Silas standing in a cloud of dust and moral cowardice. The world had shrunk to the boundaries of his fence line. He was alone, an enemy of the town, a target for a powerful man with nothing but a shotgun, a healing girl, and a ghost in his heart. He looked back at the house, at the window where Lena was watching, her small face framed in the light. He had chosen how much he was willing to lose. The answer was nothing. Not this time. Night fell like a shroud. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon all day finally broke, mirroring the one from his memory. But this storm brought more than rain and wind. It brought Thorne and his men. The headlights of 2 trucks cut through the darkness, pinning the ranch house in their cold, white glare. This time, there were no pleasantries. The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the night, splintering the wood of the porch railing next to Silas's head. He shoved Lena away from the window. "Get in the cellar," he ordered, "and don't come out, no matter what you hear." Her eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded, a flicker of the old fear returning. He watched her disappear down the trap door before turning back to the fight. The house became his fortress. He knew its every creak, its every shadow. He moved through the darkness like a wraith, a phantom in his own home. He was not a gunslinger, but a rancher. He fought with the stubborn, unyielding grit of a man defending his soil. A blast from a shotgun tore through the living room wall, showering him with plaster. He returned fire from the kitchen window, the roar of his rifle a defiant answer to their assault. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and rain. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he was fighting for more than just his own life. He was fighting for the quiet laugh he'd heard by the fence post, for the sleeping girl in his daughter's bed, for the chance to be something more than a monument to his own grief. In a lull, he heard a scrabbling sound behind him. It was Lena. She hadn't gone to the cellar. In her hands, she held a box of shells. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a soldier in his war. He was bleeding. A piece of shrapnel from a window frame had torn a vicious gash in his side. The pain was a hot, searing thing, and his vision was starting to swim at the edges. He slumped against the wall, trying to staunch the flow with a ripped piece of his shirt. Through the broken window, he could see Thorne's men advancing, using the storm as cover. They were closing in. It was over. He had failed again. He looked at Lena, huddled in the corner, her small hands loading shells into his spare rifle with a desperate focus he'd taught her just days ago. He had put this on her. His foolish pride, his need for redemption, had brought this hell down on them both. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos, the rumble of an old engine, coming fast. A pair of dim, sputtering headlights appeared at the end of the drive. It was Doc Miller's old truck, not the store owner, but his brother, the town's semi-retired physician. A man Silas had once called a friend, before he'd shut the world out. The truck slid to a halt, and the old doctor, a man in his 70s, emerged with a hunting rifle in his gnarled hands. He fired a shot into the air. "Jedediah Thorne," he yelled. his voice surprisingly strong against the wind. "You want to kill a man, you do it in the light, not like a coward in a storm." Thorne's men hesitated, their attention split. It was the opening Silas needed. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the fire in his side. He handed the spare rifle to Lena. "Cover the back window," he said, his voice strained. "Don't shoot, unless you have to." He was putting his life in her hands, a final, absolute act of trust. This was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. The standoff lasted until dawn. The doctor's arrival and his unshakable presence had given Thorne's men pause. They were hired muscle, not soldiers willing to die for a cause. As the first light of morning painted the sky, they retreated, taking their wounded with them. Thorne's car remained, a silent black monument to the night's violence. The fight was not won, merely postponed. Doc Miller patched Silas's side, his fingers deft and practiced. "You stubborn old fool," he said, but his eyes held a grudging respect. "You poked the biggest hornet's nest in the state." Silas looked at Lena, who was cleaning the rifles with a solemn determination. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a steely resolve that mirrored his own. He knew they couldn't stay here. They couldn't live under this shadow. He had to end it. On one of Thorne's men, left behind in the retreat, Silas had found a small leather-bound ledger. It wasn't money. It was names. Children's names, dates, prices. Lena's name was there. It was the proof he needed. He wasn't going to a federal marshal. This was a disease that had infected his own community, and it had to be cut out here. He and the doctor, with Lena between them, drove Thorne's own pristine automobile into the heart of Persimmon Creek. He walked into the sheriff's office, the ledger in his hand, and placed it on the desk. "You wanted to know how much I was willing to lose, Brody," Silas said, his voice quiet but ringing with authority. "Now you're all going to see what you were willing to ignore." The power dynamic had inverted. The secret was out. The man who ruled from the shadows was about to be dragged into the unforgiving light. The ledger was a lit match in a town built of dry rot. The shame was a more powerful force than Thorne's money. Faced with undeniable proof of his crimes, exposed by the two most stubborn old men in the county, the town turned. Sheriff Brody, his career and conscience on the line, had no choice but to arrest Jedediah Thorne. The home for unfortunate children was dismantled, and the story of its horrors finally came to light. The silence that fell over Persimmon Creek was one of reckoning. Silas's ranch healed just as he did. The broken windows were replaced, the bullet holes patched, but the biggest change was the quiet. It was different now. It was no longer the sound of emptiness, but of peace. The ghosts were finally gone. 6 months later, he was in the barn, not because of a whimper, but because a new foal had been born. Lena was beside him, her hand stroking the foal's soft nose. She was taller now, healthier, and her laughter, once so fragile, was now a frequent and welcome sound on the ranch. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "He looks like he's made of sunlight," she said. Silas looked from the foal to her, and then out at the vast open plains under the afternoon sky. The wind still blew, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a promise. He hadn't just saved a girl from a barn. He had found a reason to rebuild his own life from the wreckage. He had found family, not in blood, but in a bond forged in fear and defiance. He had found his way home.